Hey everyone, this is Kim Del Toro taking you through Module 4 of the practices of the places and things I watched and listened to. So I started with the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. This book was introduced by a colleague and I hadn't heard of it before, but I had a sense of what it was. I actually haven't picked up a book and really had any interest in books in a long time, so this is something that I will continue reading after the first few chapters that I've read. It really just goes through the life of a woman that was diagnosed with cancer and had cells that changed how medicine is used today. Her doctors took samples of her cells and they ran tests without her permission, and they found that they had never died. So the author just goes above and beyond to research her life, her death, and her immortal cells. And that's really how the book is broken up into those three sections. To break it down, the timeline is all over the place because she jumps back and forth between when she was born and the different timelines of her children and everyone in her life. I highly recommend this book because it really shows how much some scientists dedicate to their research without even caring who or what they harm. The scientist that discovered the HeLa cells actually had mice, rabbits, guinea pigs, and all sorts of other things in his lab, just testing everything that he could. This relates to my STEM identity because it really just talks about the importance of giving credit where credit is due. Her family was not aware of how much Henrietta's cells had been contributing to science in the world. It really shows you just ethical and moral values of science and how much people value life. The podcast that I got into was Science Friday. I had gone through several of the episodes. I started with one on March 31st and it was broken down into two parts. But just for the sake of brevity, when I listened to this one, they talked about a supermassive black hole and how they were able to track that it had 30 billion suns. And they had been trying to track it since 2004, but trying to figure out how to really tell if it was a black hole. So for years and years, when they discovered the changes in gravitational lenses is what they had discovered. In the Gulf of Maine, there's phytoplankton population decrease, and a lot of it has to do with climate change and how it's warming up the oceans for them. There was a different guest on the podcast that was talking about how mumps is on the rise. As babies, we get the MMR vaccine for measles, mumps, and rubella. However, the effectiveness of the vaccine kind of wanes over time, and it's interesting to just hear how the guest talks about how some of the vaccine works for measles and rubella, but for whatever reason, it tends to wane on the mumps. So a lot of that also has to do with people and their lack of getting vaccinated nowadays, since vaccination rates have gone down since before. And then lastly, early spring, as a lot of you probably noticed how warm it has been getting, especially this past week. There was two different guests that talked about how there's still snow in a lot of places, whereas some people were having their flowers already blooming as early as March 24th. And the other guest that was on there was talking about how climate change really affects how they have this internal clock and how they have this phenological shift where if it's warm, they tend to come out sooner. So it's really throwing things off for them. I recommend this podcast for anyone who's really interested in learning on the current science news affecting our world and is interested in hearing different takes on the experts in this topic. As far as my STEM identity, listening to this podcast really helped me rediscover just my interest in science and how much there is to learn about the world and beyond. I ended up watching two movies for the movie section and not even realizing that they were both very similar in that they both take place in the 1950s and early 1960s. After the Russians had launched Sputnik into orbit. In Hidden Figures, you have Catherine, Mary, and Dorothy working for NASA as their human computers, and they work their way to get promoted while also struggling with civil rights. One of them wants to be an engineer, one of them just wants to be a supervisor of their group of women, and the other really works closely with the mathematicians in NASA. Over in October Sky, you have Homer Hickam that's inspired to build his own rocket with his friends Quentin, Royley, and Odell. He, just like the women in Hidden Figures, works really hard to accomplish his goals. I recommend it because they both really show the dedication that the women and the young boys have in accomplishing their goals, and they work really hard regardless of the obstacles that they face. As far as my STEM identity goes, after watching these movies, it inspired me to talk to my admin about starting up a science Olympiad or a science fair at my middle school. So they've already talked about putting that in place for next year, and we'll continue looking at that with colleagues. Finally, my place was the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History in DC. I realized after I was looking through my pictures that I didn't have an actual selfie. I went there on Monday, and I was just more interested in looking at all the exhibits, so I took a few pictures of myself in the museum, but I went through the gems and minerals, the geology. It reminded me of the erosion bottles we did earlier in the course. I looked at the constellations in Ocean Hall. So it's always been a fun place to go to. My recommendation is just that it has so many artifacts. There's a lot of hands-on learning and interactive displays at this museum. My STEM identity with this place was that when I was younger, my grandpa used to always take us because he liked going to the museums, and it had actually been a while since I had been to the Smithsonian. But I always found the exhibits to be really fascinating with everything that they had, and it just really brought me back to when I was a kid. So I hope that my students have this fascination for science as well in the way that I teach. And here's just another picture of us riding some scooters through the city. Thanks for listening.